Hello everybody, welcome to WhatCulture Gaming. I'm Scott, joined by Kirsten.
Hello.
Hello, Kirsten, my friend. There has been some conversations brewing from an ex-Sony Worldwide Studios head, Shawn Layden. He's the lovable small little chap that used to come out at E3 and various press conferences over the last few years. He's on sabbatical at the minute. He actually joined Sony back in 1987 and he's finally sort of taken some time off. But he did an interview as part of this conversation with GamesBeat's Dean Takahashi. It was this conference thing called Game Lab Live. And basically he was just talking about the different sort of factors that go into how the AAA model as it is right now isn't very sustainable. And it's just, you look at games like The Last of Us 2, Red Dead 2, and these big sort of lavish, over the top, dripping in quality titles. And something like Last of Us and Red Dead are good examples because they feel like, they feel like they're in a category all themselves. Like it feels like so many hours went into making these things. And you couldn't apply that to every single title. So yeah, he was sort of just breaking that stuff down and said as to why it's not sustainable. And there's various factors that he was saying as to, as we go into the next generation, why, these things aren't going to keep going. So the first one is budget. He says that, like different game budgets have blown up so much. He remembers the time when the average AAA game budget was around 1 million. But this generation, they've blown up to 80 million and 150 million, which is ridiculous by comparison. And things like Last of Us are just so huge. He says that most larger titles take about 5 years to complete, and that doesn't even account for marketing costs as well in terms of the figures that we just said, so you can kind of double those figures anyway. And he says that he thinks the industry as a whole needs to sit back and say, okay, what are we building? What's the audience expectation? What is the best way to get our story across and say what we need to say? And he also says that it's hard for every adventure game to shoot for the 50 or 60 hour gameplay milestone because that's going to be so much more expensive to achieve. In the end, you might close some interesting creators and their stories out of the market if that's the kind of threshold they have to meet. So I guess we can just talk about that. There's more things to get to in terms of, like the cost of retail and things like that. But I guess it's that overall expectation of thinking of like Last of Us 2 and Red Dead 2. Where are you at in terms of expectations for AAA games? Should they look like Last of Us type stuff? Or have you I don't know, have you ever found yourself being disappointed with something recently if it's not as glossy as it could be?
I think it depends on the game. I think if you are going for a realistic game and you're using, motion capture and stuff like that, then obviously there is some sort of expectation there for it to look as realistic as possible. And I personally thought that The Last of Us did a brilliant job in general with the first game. So I was blown away with the second game with just how realistic everything was. The people themselves look so much more realistic than I thought they were going to. They managed to get the eyes right. But like you said, it's the amount of time and effort that obviously goes into that is so much more. And what I think is incredible about when they do this within games, it's not expected, but I feel like they feel like it's expected. It's like, everything has to be real and we have to use performance capture all the time for everything so that movements are perfect and stuff. And not every single game has to be 100% realistic. It completely depends on the game. But if that is what you're going for, then yes, it takes a lot more time, a lot more effort, and a lot more budget, because not only are you having to create these elements out of nothing, but you are also having to hire real actors and have them perform real scenes. It's not made up on a computer screen. It is simply laid over what is physically happening. So there is just so much more that they have to do with games like that. And it just feels like an unnecessary step. I know that they do want to make it as realistic as possible, like I said, but it doesn't have to be that way. Not every single game has to be 100% realistic. It doesn't, you get very good games that aren't, that sort of quality. It doesn't have to be real people and real looking dragons and all that sort of stuff. People enjoy games just as much when they're cartoony and silly and stupid, as long as they're crisp and clean, which you can achieve nowadays, which people have been able to achieve for a long time. It just seems like sometimes there just are these unnecessary steps to making things be, like I said, within AAA games, having it be crisp and clean and perfect. And yeah, I mean, that is why I think the budget is just increasing and increasing, is because people feel like that is something they have to do. When you ask gamers, it's like, well, do we enjoy it? Yes, we do. And is it beautiful? Yes, of course it is, and we appreciate that. But it doesn't have to be every single game. It doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, it's like that's the thing. I saw Jim Sterling tweeting out about like the amount of animations, individual animations that are in something like Last of Us 2, and where if you go to upgrade one of the guns in that game, every single gun has its own separate like animation that assumedly they've motion captured, or even if they hand animated it per gun. Like you said, it's a question of necessity. Like, do these games? I keep citing Last of Us 2 and Red Dead 2 because I feel like they are just these huge, like I said, they're dripping in quality, but they also took like in Red Dead's case almost 10 years to develop, and Last of Us 2 is about 5 or 6. And it's that thing of necessity. It's like, has the gaming industry kind of boxed themselves in by creating this assumption of what a AAA game is, and can they sort of pivot the marketing, the advertising, the hype, everything else to get a mass audience on the size they are now to get excited for a game that isn't on the level of Last of Us 2 or Red Dead 2? Like, I would say yes, because I think it all comes down to gameplay, and you could just have, a great character, great hook or whatever. But I think that's one of the things he's getting at, is that they've sort of like, they have created this expectation. Like you said, though, it doesn't have to be every single game. So he also talks about one of the things that's really insane is that the retail cost for games over the last, he's been there for 30-ish years at Sony. He's been with the PlayStation side of things for about 25. But he talks about the retail cost has always stayed the same. And he says that it's one of the weirdest freaks of nature in gaming, because especially when you look to other sort of mediums, they'll modulate costs based on the how much it costs to actually make the product in the first place. Whereas game, the budget costs have got so much bigger, but the retail cost stays the same. So he says that's sort of one of the weirdest freaks of nature, and he says that a lot of gaming audiences react negatively to the idea of the retail cost changing, which we do every time something like that comes out. But he says the games themselves have become so much bigger. So he said, it's been around $59.99 since he started in the business, but the cost of games has gone up about 10 times. If you don't have elasticity on the price point, but you do have huge volatility on the cost line, the model itself becomes more difficult. This generation, he means the next generation, he thinks that you're going to see both those things collide. So I guess that's the thing, is like, how would you say you answer that? Because I think I would pay more for something like a Last of Us or a Red Dead or a God of War. I would bring down something, I don't know, games that are more like platforms for content that are going to have things plugged in. Maybe you don't charge that full price straight away. Maybe you plug things in over time. I think like changing the retail cost might be one of the easiest solutions, but I don't know how people would take that.
Yeah, I think, like I said, it depends on the game with how much you're going to charge people for it. Like, I remember, I'm obviously aware of what goes on behind the scenes of like video games and stuff, as a lot of gamers are, but I know there's a lot of casual gamers that may not, and there's obviously parents of gamers that definitely aren't. So you have that situation where it comes to Christmas time and birthday, and it's sort of, I want this game, mum, and it's like, 50-60 quid, God, that's a lot of money for a game. But
100.
Yeah, exactly. But they don't understand how much effort and how much time and money has actually gone into that game. So I think that when you are aware of something like that, when someone comes out and says, it's going to be £50-60 for a game for something like The Last of Us, you don't mind, because you think, there's, like you said, they've been working on this 5 to 6 years, it's all performance captured, like it looks incredibly realistic, so you don't mind spending a lot of money on a game that has had a lot of money and time put into it. But I think that you can definitely change how much a game costs depending on, not how much time has gone into it, because a lot of time goes into games, but the amount of money that's behind it. If something has cost, like you said, like 18 million or however much these games cost nowadays, then charge £50-60 for it. But if it's costing considerably less, then you can't go charging the same amount for something that is like maybe a little DLC or like a little Nintendo Switch game that might have only sort of cost like maybe $1 million to make. You can't put that down as a £60-70 game, because people will realise that. They'll get into the game and go, what have I paid for here? This definitely isn't worth the price. And that's when you then get these companies panicking and then immediately putting these games on sale, which is even worse, because you've then forked out all this money for it to then a couple of days people realise they're, the mistake that they've made, and they go, actually, maybe we should have put that up for £30.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? There's nothing worse than paying the price that they thought that you should be paying, realising it's not worth that, and then they realise it's not worth that. It's like...
Totally.
Yeah, like, I don't know. I feel like a little bit of research needs to be done with how well a game plays, how well it looks, and how much time and money has gone into it, and judging the budget that way.
Honestly, that's such a fascinating point you said about like perception. It's like, yeah, like we as like, industry followers are like totally aware of like, like how much effort went into something like a Naughty Dog game. We know about Neil Druckmann and the creative team and Haley Gross and whatever. But like you said, there's all the sort of casual people or someone who's buying a game for someone else who would react way more negatively to like, their yearly edition of FIFA being, kicked up by 20, 30 pounds or dollars. And they obviously have to take that into account as well. So yeah, I was saying, assuming that, it's an easy solution, just crank up the retail price. But that obviously affects the wider sort of perception of gaming overall, and whether gaming, if each game starts to be about £100, then all of a sudden gaming is this luxury thing, or these titles are viewed as luxury items, and it meets out in a different way. Like the assumption of what most people are playing wouldn't be, The Last of Us 2 wouldn't hit its sales target as much if the cost was so much more. So there's that. He does end talking about what his sort of suggestions about going forward into the next generation. He says, if you were going to change the retail cost or the budget side of it, instead of spending 5 years making an 80-hour game, what does 3 years and a 15-hour game look like? He says, personally, as an older gamer, he would welcome a return to the 12 to 15-hour AAA game. He says, first of all, he would finish a lot more games, and like a well-edited piece of literature or a movie, looking at the discipline around that could give gaming more tighter, more compelling pieces of content. And he says, it's something he would like to see a return to going forward. I guess we've kind of already meted these things out, because you would just associate a bigger price point with a bigger game. But what do you think? I mean, we obviously grew up across like the 90s and 2000s when there were so many other games out there, much more variety of stuff, with the same price points, but with drastically reduced budgets. Do you think that would be a way to go forward? Like you just have someone like EA, put out 5-10 different Star Wars games for much smaller budgets, as opposed to saving up and doing the big one.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like as I'm getting older, I'm noticing there is a lot less games coming out each year, because it did used to seem like there was just an abundance of them when I was a kid, and a lot of them were very good. They were good games, and I think, like you said, because people are trying to focus on, we have to put all this effort and all this money and all this time into a game, and they're focusing on trying to make it as long as possible. And it doesn't have to be that way. You can have a good game and it still be short. And the thing is that the more effort you try to put into these games to make them longer, the more likely that there's going to be parts of that game that just are either a bit of a slog to get through, are boring, and that's when you get these negative critics going, well, the entire game isn't great, there's parts where this is boring and this doesn't make sense, and the writing kind of like lacks a little bit on these bits. That's what happens. You don't have to make a game last forever. If you have the playability there and it's an open world, that's when you get the games that do kind of go on forever. But with games like The Last of Us and Red Dead, like when there's a story there, you can't try and expand that for months, because it's just, there is going to be points where people do get bored and they do kind of give up, and that's why I think we are seeing a dramatic decrease in the amount of games that are being released, is because people feel the pressure to be like, I have to make this big huge game that looks 100% perfect, and it has to last this amount of time, and the story's got to be there. And people aren't mad. People were kind of upset with the new Resident Evil because it didn't last as long, but it was a good game. The story was there, the combat was there, it was a fun game, I enjoyed it. Was it a little bit disappointing that it was shorter? Yeah, but is that just because we're so used to seeing games last so much longer nowadays? That's
a perfect example, because I was one of those people who was like, I was expecting more, but my main problem with it was the price point, because they still charged pretty much full price for it.
Exactly.
Whereas if they'd advertised it, talked about it, the perception of that game was this sort of, DLC that became a full title, and they sold it for a reduced price, I would have been way more okay with that. I think it's fascinating. Obviously, there's no easy answers at the minute. We're going to see how things change in the next generation. But I love the idea, all the conversations around flexible price points versus, is the game, how do you attach a different price point to the game itself, and at what point does that come out during the marketing, and how do they sort of build that perception, and should it change for every single game, or do they need something like the movie approach, where you only pay one specific fee for a movie and every movie costs the same? Things like that. I think all of those conversations are fascinating. But yeah, let us know what you think down in the comments below of everything that's been said. What do you want to see going forward? Would you pay more for a game? And yeah, what do you sort of think about the general idea of flexible price points based on the games themselves? For now, I've been Scott from WhatCulture.com.
And I have been Kirsten Ria.
And we'll catch you next time. Bye.
Bye.